Welcome to the Climate Resilient Galveston webinar. Thanks for attending today. My name is Jennifer Walker, and I'm the Senior Director for the Texas Coast and Water Program at National Wildlife Federation. I'll be the moderator for today, but you'll mostly be hearing from our experts who worked on the Climate Resilient Galveston report. So I want to talk a little bit about our program first. We work to ensure that Texas manages and uses its limited water and coastal resources for the benefit of both people and wildlife, particularly with the challenges of climate change. We're not alone in this. Through a coalition of organizations called Texas Living Waters, we amplify our work and impact across the state, whether it's through advocacy at the legislature or educational and conservation campaigns or our well-known scientific research. This new report that we're going to be talking today presents a sobering look at what climate change might bring to an iconic stretch of the Texas coastline along Galveston Island. The focus of this report is twofold. One, what are some of the risks that we know are on the horizon, from sea level rise to warming waters? And two, how do we better position leaders and stakeholders to understand and embrace nature-based solutions? These are strategies that enhance and protect our ecosystems for the protection and benefit of our communities and wildlife. They are often left off the table when we talk about large built infrastructure projects like Ike Dike. Next slide. So I want to introduce you to our two panelists today. Arsum Pathak is the Senior Adaptation and Coastal Resilience Specialist for National Wildlife Federation's Texas Coast and Water Program. Her work focuses on advancing science-based climate adaptation and resilience to protect communities and ecosystems from the impact of climate change and associated extreme events in Texas and across the Gulf. In this role, she distills climate science and highlights innovative nature-based approaches to help communities and policy experts understand their baseline physical risks and develop equitable solutions in the face of climate-induced threats. She has authored and co-authored several publications on climate change impacts and adaptation, including the recently published Climate Resilient Galveston report, which we're going to be talking about today. So before joining National Wildlife Federation, Arsum received her PhD in environmental science and policy at the University of South Florida, where she researched and published on climate impacts and adaptation decision-making in small islands using a systems approach. Our other presenter today is Amanda Fuller. Amanda has 15 years of experience advancing water and coastal policies for the benefit of people and wildlife. Prior to forming Fuller Coast and Water Strategies, Amanda worked for the World Wildlife Fund and spent more than 10 years with National Wildlife Federation. Throughout her career, Amanda has developed and advocated for sound water and coastal policies, as well as ecosystem restoration projects in Texas and across the Gulf in federal, state, and local decision-making venues. Amanda works to advance the use of equity-centered, nature-based solutions to natural hazards being exacerbated by our changing climate. Amanda holds a law degree from Texas Tech University School of Law, where she focused on environmental and water law, and an undergraduate degree in political science from Texas Christian University. We are so lucky to have these two wonderful experts as part of our team, and this report is really excellent, and I'm really look forward to you all hearing more about it. Before I pass it on to Dr. Pathak, the lead author of our report, and Amanda, our consultant and coastal policy specialist, I want to thank them and thank you all for being here today. And just a bit of housekeeping, we're going to hold questions till the end of the presentation. Please feel free as they come to you to enter them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll be collecting those, and I will moderate the questions and answers at the end. But thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it over to our team.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I echo Jennifer. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and hear us talking about some of the key findings and recommendations from our new report. So really, the big picture purpose of this work is to support coastal resilience in Galveston through two primary objectives. So the first one is synthesizing the latest information regarding climate change related risks and the impacts, the socioeconomic and environmental impacts of those risks on the island, and then use that risk-based framing to then identify adaptation strategies to mitigate the impacts to communities as well as natural assets in Galveston. The product that we are sharing today is this climate vulnerability and resilience assessment. And we've tried to incorporate input from relevant stakeholders in the area in order to craft this product. The idea is, as Jennifer mentioned, provide the science of how climate is changing and will be impacting the island, but also highlight the importance of making time investments in climate adaptation, particularly nature-based solutions. I will say before we begin that this is not meant to be an end-all prescriptive product. We really want to use this as a foundational tool to start those conversations on resilience planning and support a lot of good initiatives that are already taking place on the island. For broader context, Galveston is part of several broader planning efforts that already focus on climate resilience and adaptation. You can see some of those plans and programs that we have looked at on your screen today. Our work builds on these existing initiatives with the aim to integrate nature-based solutions into the larger framework of ongoing regional and state-level planning. For the purpose of this assessment, looking at these plans and ongoing initiatives was also really helpful and essential for ensuring that the strategies that we were recommending they're feasible and they're supported by broader policy and funding mechanisms.
We also developed this report in the context of a really unprecedented funding landscape. So, for example, funds from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or also called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, have allocated funds to shoring up coastal environments. And they've emphasized the use of nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure for coastal protection in particular. And so those funds have funneled through several different programs and really enhanced our ability to pursue these approaches. On the screen here, I have a QR code, which will take you to a really great resource that the Texas General Land Office has developed of various federal and state funding programs for projects related to coastal protection. Next. And the National Wildlife Federation has also assembled a guide. It's a nature-based solutions funding database, so specific to nature-based solutions. And it displays information currently on about 90 different programs. And so users can sort the information based on their particular interest and their particular circumstances. And this is applicable for areas all across the country. And so with all of the opportunities that are out there to actually fund and implement nature-based solutions and at a large scale, it's really an important time for places like Galveston to prioritize these approaches and pursue some of these funding options. So let me hand it back to Arsum to go over our scientific findings.
Thanks, Amanda. I will start with sharing some of the key climate risks that we focused on. So sea level rise is a primary concern for the low-lying island. We found that there has already been about a 2 feet increase in sea levels over the past century. And this rate of increase is not linear, but it's speeding up exponentially just over the last 14 years, sea level rise has increased more than 8 inches. And this is by amount of fastest increases across the country, based on recent analysis by the Washington Post that came less than a month ago. And with climate change, we'll continue to see this rate of increase speeding up with more greenhouse gases, glaciers melting faster, and oceans warming, all of which increasing the water levels in the Gulf of Mexico. Next, I want to show us some maps from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration agency that models those potential scenarios with future increase in sea level rise for end of the century. So this one's an intermediate low increase in water levels. This is about a 3 feet increase, still a lot of flooding. Intermediate scenario, which is a 5 feet increase. An intermediate high, 6 feet increase. And then a high scenario of 8 feet increase, where you could see most of the island become susceptible to flooding and inundation. I do want to say that these are still projections. The actual increase will depend on a number of factors, such as the emissions in the air and the policies that are getting enacted today. But as you can see, still a lot of risks, even with that lower end best case intermediate low scenario, which there's a lot of certainty and likelihood of us exceeding that at this point. The next one is coastal storms. Map here shows most of the island being vulnerable to storm surge. Again, this is from the most recent data from the 2023 Texas Coastal Resiliency Master Plan by the Texas General Land Office, showing a high storm surge vulnerability, especially towards that west end. And with climate change, again, we're expected to see an increase in the frequency of more of those severe category storms, so category 4 and 5 hurricanes. More of these low probability, high consequence events. And in terms of planning, I want to flag that this is just really important because we want to make sure that the approaches that we're planning today, any climate adaptation approach, they're done in light of these future extreme events and the consequences that they would pose to our communities, infrastructure, as well as the wildlife. This is an example of how storms will be more destructive with climate change. This analysis, which was done by Hart Research Institute at Texas A&M University. So what they found was if a storm similar to Hurricane Ike were to hit Galveston in 2100, the surge would be 450 square miles greater than what the island experienced in 2008. And the height of the surge will be an additional 2.5 feet higher. And that's essentially because the surge would be placed on top of an elevated sea level. So same storm, same category and magnitude, but still a lot more damage potential with rise towards the end of the century. Next one's high tide flooding, becoming a more regular thing already in Galveston, again, primarily due to rising sea levels. And what we found was it's only going to get worse. So these predictions here, again, data from NOAA, they show that we could go from a few days of flooding per decade at present to over 100 days. Actually closer to 200 if you look at those 2050 mid of the century projections. So increasing those days, posing threats to the day-to-day infrastructure and critical facilities. All these climate risks that we're sharing, whether it's sea level rise, storm surge, high tide flooding, they will cause flooding, erosion, and even the risk of permanent inundation on the island. But really, a particular concern that we wanted to flag is for the coastal habitats that provide buffer against these impacts. And losing these ecosystems would mean that the impacts will be felt even more strongly to the communities and infrastructure on the island. So this is an example of land cover in Galveston at present. This is the change in land cover with an intermediate low scenario, so that 3 feet increase. Here there's a lot more blue than green, which essentially shows a loss of freshwater wetlands that are getting replaced by the more resilient saltwater wetlands. And then with an intermediate high scenario, which is that 6 feet increase, projected increase, there's a lot more of that purple signifying open water, permanent loss and erosion of coastal wetlands being turned into open water. Next one, water quantity and quality. Again, another major challenge for Galveston Bay. It's a tricky situation since it's susceptible to both high flow and low flow events, and it has over the past decade or so experienced alternating extreme flow events. So between 2009 to 2014, there have been more low flow events due to the Texas drought. And then from 2015 to 2020, there have been more high flow events, which can likely be attributed to Hurricane Harvey. And this, again, data comes from the Galveston report card created by the Hart Research Institute. But both impacts, both the high flow and low flow events impact water quantity and quality of the bay system, as well as the marine life that thrives in the bay. And with climate change, again, these extremes are going to continue intensifying, causing more longer prolonged droughts, as well as more intense storms, as we saw earlier. And of course, not just natural features, our built environment is at risk too. Under the low sea level rise scenario, this is the data from the Climate Central's sea level rise tool. So it shows that about 7% of the island's home would be at risk under that low scenario, but that number increases nearly tenfold to about a little over 70% under that high sea level rise scenario. Of course, the more extreme the scenario is, the more the risks are going to be to our homes, hospitals, critical facilities, like schools and public offices, essentially all of which the pieces and the facilities essential for the functioning of the island, lowering the overall resilience and capability. The next one is social vulnerability. Of course, when we're talking about these climate risks, they will vary based on who's facing them. So certain factors such as race, ethnicity, income status lowers an individual's capacity to tackle and mitigate climate risks, i.e. the social vulnerability. So this adds a layer of another vulnerability to the physical vulnerability that the island is already facing. So on your screen here, this is a map of social vulnerability for the island. It looks like communities on the east end of the island, from like some census blocks between Jones Park to UT Medical Branch, were found to be highly vulnerable. And often what we see is that these vulnerable groups, they're separated in clusters and pockets. So they anyway have limited access to information and resources to prepare for a lot of those potential climate-induced hazards, but also after that hazard or disaster strikes, they have relatively lower capacity and funding to adapt to them. This graph here, it compares the number of socially vulnerable people in Galveston to the rest of the country. So the lighter green bar are US averages. And I know there's a lot going on here. All of this is in the full assessment. But one thing I would point here is you can see that there's more in terms of that people of color, people without a high school degree, and living in rental units in Galveston when you compare the percentages to the other census tracts in the country. This is a lot of scary information, but really this report is not meant to be a doom and gloom. The point that we want to emphasize here is that these are potential risks and that we clearly need to adapt and build resilience. So really thinking about making Galveston a model of resilience and not just the vulnerability that we're talking about. And resilience, the way we see it, is not just about weathering the next storm, but it's about thriving and building capacity after it. So in order to have that resilience framing to this work, we need solutions that are science-based, that are dynamic, and they can keep up with these future changes. And that's why nature-based solutions are really something that we strongly advocate for and are the best bet for a climate resilient Galveston. A lot of you might already be familiar with it, but the idea of nature-based solutions center on conservation and restoration of natural systems, and it can also be combined with traditional green infrastructure solutions to make them more resilient. These solutions, they offer both climate adaptation and mitigation benefits, as well as a range of other community-wide benefits. And honestly, really, the benefits that these solutions provide make them really timely investments in communities' sustainable and resilient future. Nature-based solutions comes in many shapes and forms. It could be as simple as planting trees in your neighborhood, could also mean large-scale re-engineering of watersheds. It could mean actual conservation of the natural features through easements and buyouts. Could also mean restoring the degraded features through wetland restoration or oyster reef restoration kind of projects. The basic idea here is to work with nature, using nature as our strongest ally rather than working against it, which is not always the case with the conventional engineering systems that are becoming not just more costly, but also requires a degree of maintenance, of frequent maintenance, and are not able to adapt with the changing climatic conditions. Very quickly, another resource, I'll share that in the chat after I'm done speaking, but we've also developed a set of key considerations to help communities start thinking about nature-based solutions in their planning. This includes recognizing natural systems as critical infrastructure, incorporating climate impacts on priority natural assets, addressing equity implications to avoid harming vulnerable communities through siting and land use decisions of these solutions, ensuring net positive biodiversity benefits and not just the protective benefits to the communities. When possible, protecting natural systems that are still intact and restoring the ones that are degraded and provide protective priority services. Avoid creating new hazards through poor land use decisions and understanding that natural features require the space to grow and function. And then finally, when possible, making sure that nature-based solutions are embedded into existing planning processes. Hence the idea of looking at some of those existing projects already, but it's always easy on the implementation and funding if these projects are represented in the already existing planning processes and mechanisms rather than creating an entirely new plan around it. So I think with that, with the understanding of the risks and existing planning efforts, I will pass it over to Amanda to discuss a set of recommendations that we developed for this assessment.
Great, thanks, Arsum. So when it comes to planning and understanding the protective value of nature and natural systems on Galveston Island, there's already, a tremendous amount of incredible resources to consider. So our team poured through a lot of existing Galveston specific resources, and we've listed them all in the assessment, I think on page 38. But just to name a couple that we really dove into, the comprehensive plan, the island's hazard mitigation plan, the West Galveston Island Green Print for Growth, and Vision Galveston's annual plan. So we also applied frameworks from other coastal states and other leading entities in this space, and that includes the decades of expertise from the National Wildlife Federation on nature-based solutions. So we boiled down the approaches to 4 key pillars. The first one is identifying and implementing on-the-ground projects. Second is building community capacity and cohesion to advance these projects. Third is supporting climate jobs and relevant training. And fourth is fostering a conducive regulatory and policy landscape. So in the next few slides, we'll dive a little deeper into each of these pillars, and I'll provide some examples of Galveston specific objectives that are included in the plans that we reviewed, and they've been vetted by a group of local stakeholders that we've worked with. So many of these objectives are not new to the island, and they may already be ongoing, and they should be scaled up. Next slide. So the first pillar is on the ground. And this is a broad pillar as it applies to both, and we're emphasizing support for wildlife and people through enhanced biodiversity and ecosystem services. Some on-the-ground projects appropriate for Galveston Island include living shorelines, restoration of oyster reefs, dune revegetation, sustaining freshwater inflows to bay systems around the island, marsh restoration, and more. And so you can see those listed on this slide. Next. The second pillar centers on enhancing the strength and the connectedness of the local community and their capacity to come together and advance projects in ways that are equitable to everyone. You'll notice there are only a few objectives in this pillar, but each is complex and they require a lot of outreach and education and buy-in and support. And so this would include aligning local government and NGOs and philanthropic entities and other stakeholders to do things like potentially create liaison positions between them and helping grassroots champions design nature-based solutions. Next slide. And so similar to the second pillar, Pillar 3 objectives are also complex and require a lot of support and cohesion. Promoting climate-related jobs and relevant training will help to weave climate-smart principles and practices throughout the working population on the island, as well as amongst school-aged kids and young adults. Next. And then our fourth and final pillar acknowledges that we need a conducive regulatory and policy landscape that can support nature-based solutions. There's room for creativity and in some cases, enhanced local control, such as incentivizing the integration of nature in development plans and applying the best available science to decision-making. Other objectives can frame up issues for consideration at the state level, like updating building codes across the state. No matter the decision-making venue, we need more tools in the toolbox and more guiding frameworks that help advance the use of nature-based solutions. And next slide. So that concludes our formal presentation, and I'm going to hand it back to Jennifer to help us facilitate any questions that y'all may have. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda and Arsum. That's a lot of information to deliver, and I'm sure that folks will have some questions about some of this. And while we open the floor to audience questions and give a little time for folks to put their questions into the Q&A, I want to take a minute to thank the Mitchell Foundation for their support of this project and their guidance along the way. This was really made possible by the Mitchell Foundation and their interest, and we worked with many of the groups in Galveston to vet some of these ideas and had conversations with them. So we want to share our gratitude with up on that front. And I know that some of you all are on the call today, so thank you very much from all of us. And let me manage this Q&A. So our first question really is, what would you recommend as any top priorities to get started on? Just a big question, and one of the things we really want to talk about as a result of this report.
Yeah, and that's a great question. We were very intentional in not advocating for any specific priorities at this point, understanding that this is meant to be a foundational piece of work, and we really wanted to collate all the good recommendations that already exist. Having said that, we did host a roundtable with the key stakeholders in the Galveston community, through the Vision Galveston, as well as Mitchell Foundation, which really helped us start thinking and refining these recommendations a little bit more. So you'll see in our assessment in the conclusion section, there are 4 key priorities that we flag, which is and we have one priority in each of the pillars, but essentially in pillar 1, we flag living shorelines to stabilize shoreline edges. For pillar 2, creating a city community liaison position. For pillar 3, implementing project and place-based learning through existing collaborations. And then for pillar 4, creating those local wetland protection bylaws and regulations. And this is on page 51 of the assessment, but these are the recommendations that were rising to the top of the stakeholder group's priority that we had the roundtable with.
Wonderful. Amanda, did you want to add anything to that? I think she covered it.
Yeah, I think we're good. I mean, the kind of consensus coming out of the group. That's what we want to support. And so those are the things that Arsum just shared with everybody. And again,
Amanda, for me, I don't know if for anyone else, but right when you got to the heart of the matter there, you froze up. So.
I didn't say anything.
Oh, okay. Well then, all right.
From Arsum.
Okay,
Arsum.
great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just add one more thing though?
Yeah.
I do want to say for these recommendations, really our goal, our next steps to this work is to continue building on this. So this provides us a good starting point to start those conversations on resilience and what are some of those like key recommendations. But we do want to spend more time talking with the community stakeholders and leaders to see where time, capacity, and resources should be invested as we move forward with them.
Great. Here's another question that's about funding. So how likely is it that Galveston can access some of the funding that is available? How competitive will it be? And what will be our best approach to securing this funding? That's a 3-in-1, but.
Do you want me to go, Arsum?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I think that's really difficult to predict. And we certainly are not, in a position to be doling out funds. But what we do know from all the different programs that we follow really closely is that we think Galveston is in a situation to be really competitive across the country in these different pots of money, so the federal sources. And that's for a lot of reasons. One, the island's experiencing a lot of the natural hazards that are being exacerbated by climate change. And so you can almost kind of think of it as a little bit of a learning lab, not just in the Gulf, but across the country on coastal hazards. Two, because of the social vulnerability indicators that Arsum showed earlier and are, reported on in the assessment, a lot of what the federal programs are trying to do is focus not just on coastal protection or nature-based solutions. They're focused on underserved communities, communities that, kind of fall within the Justice 40 guidelines and things like that. So I think there's a lot of important factors that Galveston in particular has compared to other areas across the country. I'm sure there's a lot more to say on that, but those are kind of the top things that come to my mind.
Yeah, I'll also add just the
Arsum, do you want to say anything else?
I was going to add the extent of natural features that the island has, and that with the development priorities. I think that's an interesting balance because as the island develops more in the future, there is a clear need to do that in a way that is synergistic with the natural features and natural environments on the island. So that opens up opportunities to protecting and conserving the natural spaces and securing the funding that follows for those conservation and restoration type of projects.
Wonderful. So we have a question about resilience. Do you have a sense of how much resilience the recommendations you offer would provide? If all the recommendations were accepted, would it be enough to protect Galveston against even the lowest projected sea level rise?
That's the dream, right?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. Resilience is always hard to quantify. I could see a good next step to this work is creating those resilience metrics to sort of start tracking these recommendations and where those resources need to be invested in. With that, I don't know if I can answer to if all the recommendations were accepted or if that's the dream future, but I don't know to what extent we could hope for that. Also, again, I think I said this earlier, but the time, capacity, and resources are limited. So we would really need to prioritize what is most feasible with the resources that we have, and where those resources need to be invested in terms of in our journey towards resilience.
Yes.
Amanda, if you have anything to add.
I just think when we're talking about nature-based solutions in particular, scale and right-sizing them is key to their impact and their success, right? And so those can be smaller projects. In many cases, though, they need to be larger projects. So to me, that's kind of a big factor.
Yeah. Speaking of projects, we have a question here about the Ike Dike, which I'm sure everyone's heard of. So how does this set of recommendations relate to the ongoing discussion around Ike Dike? And do we take a position on Ike Dike and whether or not it should be built?
Yeah, so this report does not take a position on whether or not the Ike Dike or the coastal spine should be constructed. And really that's because we want to sort of nudge a focus more towards nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, as we've already laid out, there's an unprecedented amount of money available for these approaches. And so there's no better time to pursue them. And if you wanted to compare that to the coastal spine project, for example, that funding isn't there. So funding is a big issue. How long it takes to build, implement is a big issue. Efficacy over decades is another huge issue. So with nature-based solutions, what they tend to do, I mean, they will require maintenance. They do require maintenance, but they tend to adapt on their own, and they provide benefits 24/7 all the time, and not just in terms of when there's a disaster, a storm that comes. So there's a lot of reasons to maybe shift the focus and come back to what we know really well, which is restoring and conserving natural systems. So those are some of my initial thoughts around that.
Wonderful, thank you. So you mentioned a coastal resilience liaison. I know we've heard coastal resilience officers in cities, coastal focus if it's a coastal community. Are there examples of cities that y'all know of that have these in place? Is this a model that Galveston should be following?
Yeah, so this is one of the recommendations from the Vision Galveston plans, and something that was highly prioritized by the stakeholder group that we held a roundtable with. The position, it might not be directly labeled as coastal resilience liaison. It might take different names and titles. Some cities have coastal resilience officers, CROs. I think Houston has one. Coastal resilience planners, a lot of liaison responsibilities fall under their wheelhouse. I know Hawaii for sure has coastal resilience planner positions. So it's sort of a mixed bag, but essentially the idea is to have a dedicated person who's playing that role of connecting what's happening in the city government and city leadership with the key stakeholders and community groups, whether it's called a community coastal resilience liaison or a resilience planner or resilience officer. It just varies from city to city.
Yeah, and we have a follow-up here, one that's very much related to it. So I'll go ahead and ask it in case Amanda wants to add anything too. But we've mentioned Galveston becoming a model community for nature-based solutions, but also how it approaches climate resilience and dealing with some of these climate-driven hazards. So the question says we always look for best practices, and other, to emulate other, cities want to do things that other cities have done and have learned lessons. So can we recommend other communities that are already serving as models? And they may be the ones that you've listed, but are there folks doing particularly good work in this space?
Yeah, that's a good question. For when we were drafting our recommendations, we looked at lots of good plans from Maryland. They had good nature-based green infrastructure plans on a city level. We looked through that. EcoAdapt actually has this CakeX platform, which includes a lot of good case studies on city-specific information on resilience planning. So that was, again, a really helpful resource. I'm trying to think of like other cities. Yeah, Maryland is jumping for me right now because of such good examples. Louisiana, I mean, at a state level, has a really good coastal resilience planning process, which Texas has modeled after. So that has been an interesting one. New Jersey, again, has some of those like city-specific resilience planning efforts that are going on. And then I'll throw this one here because I have their newsletter, but Connecticut surprisingly has really good city-specific funding opportunities and resilience planning efforts that are ongoing. There's some at top of my mind right now. I don't know, Amanda, if you have others to add there.
I don't know if you mentioned this yet, but North Carolina is typically held up in really high regards as, to a particular city, but as having embraced nature-based solutions, particularly have created a lot of policy and support for them.
Great. And then I'm looking over here in the chat because I'm looking at the Q&A. There's a few questions here, but one of the attendees mentioned that the city of Boston has made great progress with coastal resiliency as well. So another community to check out. There's a question here in the chat. As a business owner, what can I do to help support this initiative? And I presume as a business owner in Galveston.
Great question. And I really appreciate folks starting to think and position themselves in these resilience planning discussion. So we have a lot of recommendations that you could do at a community or individual level. So we talk about doing place-based trainings or backyard sort of initiatives, like National Wildlife Federation has a program to sort of start that environmental stewardship within your property as well as your community. We also talk about more of those site-specific green infrastructure projects that folks can install on their own properties. So there are a lot of those individual measures that you can take. But a big one that I want to suggest is just being advocates for good projects in your community, participating in the discussions around resilience, participating in the public outreach, open public participation processes that are ongoing with the community, and then advocating for more of the projects, more of the science-based natural infrastructure projects, in addition to all those individual measures that you can take.
Thank you. And I see in the chat too that there's a more of a comment, but really about partnerships being important, really building on that theme. And then I also, you know, there's the Green Galveston Action Committee, which is a bunch of different groups in Galveston. We've met with them a couple of times, a lot of really great knowledge and resources and people that you know, are working in all places in the community. And then it's really important to have conversations with leadership, with city leadership, county and city, and not just when a decision's being made, but frequently, and so that you can you know, you can have informed leadership and people can be ready to partner, because frequently with some of these funding decisions, partnerships are key, as the commenter points out, that if you can demonstrate that you're working in partnership, then that helps boost applications for funding. You know, the criteria are different for all of them, but that's definitely, they want to see people working together. So there's one more question here, and I've got a couple more, but you know, the question asker points out that just because money is available for a solution, whether it's nature or engineered, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a great project. So what do we need to do to fully understand the ability of the solutions here to provide resilience?
Yes, I fully agree. Nature-based solutions are not a silver bullet solution to all our climate risks and resilience challenges. What it would really take to fully understand these solutions and implement them is the communities and the active stakeholders in the community really need to make these decisions based on the needs of the community, what they prioritize, where these solutions, of course, there needs to be the scientific research lens to it, where we need more data on where we need to implement this and strategically plan them. But simultaneously, parallel to this is making sure that we are engaging the communities in these conversations. The projects that we are steering are community driven and not coming from any external source or body. People who know the island best are in the best position to make those decisions. So really making sure that they are at the table of decision making in both project identification and as you continue to design and implement that project and make it more and more of a reality from that conceptual stage.
Wonderful. Thank you. Somebody suggested, you know, joining the Green Galveston Action Committee as a way, and I think that's a wonderful idea if folks aren't aware of that. I know Christine Bryant is on this call. Maybe she could put some information in the chat. But we have met with the Green Galveston Action Team several times during the development of this report, and really, really wonderful resource. So I definitely support that comment. So Arsum, can you talk a little bit about some of the next steps for this work, and you know, and how do we move from talking about the findings and socializing them and moving into actual projects? And I know you have some experience with this on other parts of the coast, but what's your vision for Galveston?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first big piece for us is we want to continue the outreach and share findings through different venues. So presentations like this, webinars, community meetings. But we really want to make sure that everyone is informed about the risks and proposed solutions out of this assessment. Taking a step further than that, we want to build support for the recommendations that are coming out of this assessment. So we want to continue communicating the benefits and importance of nature-based solutions, and eventually build that support among the community leaders, stakeholders, and residents. We want to continue identify priority recommendations. So I know we talk about it towards the end of the assessment in our conclusion, the 4 recommendations that came from our stakeholder group through the Green Galveston Action Team. But really bringing in more folks at the table, continue honing in on the recommendations, and making sure we are collaboratively identifying projects. And then eventually, really the whole point of this work is to move the conversations from science to project level. So we want to support implementation to the extent possible. We want to support the groups and organizations that are leading the projects already, help them with finding, connecting the dots between some of those federal and state funding and grant opportunities, help them with grant applications, and just connecting with potential funders to make sure that money and resources are flowing towards good projects for resilience in Galveston.
Wonderful. Well, we are coming up to the end of our time here. Last chance for questions from the audience. I see that we've got some great additions to the chat here about the Galveston Bay Estuary Program and the contact information for Anna Weiss for the Green Galveston Committee. So make sure to make notes of those. I want to thank Amanda and Arsum and Amal for all their work in putting this together. I want to thank all of the attendees. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any follow-up questions or want to learn more about the report. I want to thank the Mitchell Foundation for supporting this important work and supporting the activities that will be ongoing once this now that the report is released. And so thank you all. We'll have a recording posted online shortly, and have a really good